Welcome to the TC Dojo, where you choose the topics and we find the experts. This morning, we are excited to have Mark Baker as our visiting Dojo master. We all know Mark. Mark is a 25-year veteran of the technical communication industry with particular experience in developing task-oriented, topic-based content and technical communication for the web. He has worked as a technical writer, a publications manager, a structured authoring consultant, a trainer, a designer, an architect, and a builder of structured authoring systems. This presentation is the last of 3. At SDC Summit last year, his 45-minute presentation turned into 90 minutes, and there were still questions. So he broke his presentation down into 3 parts. Today you'll get part 3. If you missed the first 2 sessions, you can see them on YouTube on the TC Dojo channel. Let's get started. I'll turn the presentation over to Mark. Show your screen. Mark, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So, information architecture bottom up. Today we're going to talk about tools. In the last couple of sessions, we talked about organization of content, how one organizes content so that...
Mark, you're getting a little far away.
When a user arrives at the content, it can be any page, and they then have to navigate from that point. In the previous session, we talked about how to write for people who are arriving that way using the every page is page one approach. Today we're going to talk about tools. A couple of basic assertions about tools to begin with. One is that you can do a bottom-up information architecture and every page is page one with any authoring tool. The second is that every authoring tool has a built-in set of ideas about information architecture. They are all set up to make a particular architecture easy. Their defaults support a particular architecture. And so whatever tool you choose is leading you in the direction of a particular architecture. You can, with that tool, do something different in every case, but every one of them has got a built-in presumption about information architecture, and some of them are quite different. The built-in presumptions about information architecture in Confluence, for instance, are very different from those in Madcap Flare, are very different from those in FrameMaker. And they will naturally lead you in certain directions. Also, something really important I want to emphasize from the beginning is that there are 2 different metrics that we should think about when we're choosing tools. Traditionally, with top-down information architectures, top-down information architectures typically have been published one time as a whole. In other words, it's what I call the wedding day style of publication, where there is months and perhaps even years of planning that all go into the great day in the hopes that it will all come off perfectly and be remembered for a very long time. But the actual event of publishing all happens at once. And so the metric that matters for a tool to do that is what is the cost to publish the whole thing on an infrequent basis. This is not how things tend to work on the web. On the web, you tend to be putting up a page today, a page tomorrow, taking down another one, changing, deleting. Everything is changing all the time on the web. And so minimizing the cost to publish everything at once every 6 months isn't the best metric for measuring that kind of tool. The metric you want for that kind of tool, and this is more typical of a bottom-up information architecture, is minimizing the cost to add, change, or delete one page at a time. That's a substantially different metric, and different tools will optimize for that in different ways. So it's very important when you're thinking about your tool choice to think about what your efficiency metric is. Are you looking for a tool that's going to minimize the cost of publishing the whole thing occasionally, or are you looking for a tool that's going to minimize the cost to add, change, and delete one page at a time? And I'll show you an example of how a tool might optimize for the second of these a little later in the presentation. So, I think what I'm going to do is talk about some of the key things you want to look for in a tool to do a bottom-up information architecture and every page is page one topics. One of the most important features of every page is page one topic is that it follows a well-defined pattern. So we saw in the last session, this is something you naturally find in good every page is page one content. It's not something that's imposed on it externally. It's what naturally happens. Because a good every page is page one topic is supporting one well-defined need for a user, and if you're supporting one well-defined need, it's very likely that the pattern of what you say and the order you say it and the way you say it is going to be the same each time. So recipes have a familiar pattern, car reviews have a familiar pattern, API descriptions have a familiar pattern. And so one of the things you want in any tool is support for patterns. That can come in the form of some kind of support for topic typing. That also gets called information modeling, information typing, content modeling. All of those terms get used for this. They get used for other things too, so it can be a bit confusing. But the basic idea that we can say, this is the stuff that you want to do and in this particular order. Another way to do this is through templates. So many traditional word processors have templating facilities. Wikis, like Confluence, for instance, has a templating facility. The difference between a topic type and a template is generally the template gets removed when you finish writing, so the template doesn't continue to exist, whereas the topic type continues to exist and becomes part of the content. Either way, though, they can help you create consistent patterns, and that's important. Linking is obviously really important in any tool that you're going to use for a bottom-up architecture, because linking is fundamental to how bottom-up architectures work. One of the key things we see in a bottom-up architecture is that the architecture is in the page itself. It is in the links that are contained in the text of the page and the boundaries of the page, but it's the page that is the place from which one navigates to the next page, as opposed to there being a kind of superstructure like a table of contents, where you navigate in the table of contents and you arrive at the page. Bottom-up architecture, you navigate from the page, and so linking becomes essential. And so you want to look at how do you minimize the cost of creating links? How do you minimize the cost of ensuring the consistency of links? How do you implement a link policy, and how do you make sure it's been followed consistently? How do you avoid broken links? And how do you manage links in reused content? If you're doing any kind of content reuse, what happens when content is used in different circumstances, and how do you manage links in those cases? So those are all important things to look at when you're choosing a tool for a bottom-up architecture. Categorization and lists. One of the things I think we talked about a little bit in the last session was the role lists play in a bottom-up architecture. A table of contents implies that it is all of the contents in one list. But what we see in typical bottom-up architectures, and you can look at places like Wikipedia, you can look at Amazon, you can look at YouTube, is they make a large use of lists, and the lists are topical. They're related to a certain type of content, a certain type of interest. So and those lists form a really important part of the bottom-up navigation. And we'll see, in the example I'm going to show later, but again, we'll see the role of lists. So you want to look at what support does this tool give me for categorization and lists. Categorization Usually in architecture it gets reflected in the form of a list. So if things belong to certain categories, then I can get a list of the things in that category. And wikis in particular tend to do this. So you don't have to write that list. You assign the topic to a category, and then the wiki itself will generate the list for you. So you want to look at features like that. How can I do categorization of content, and how can I generate lists from that categorization? What support does it have for doing that? We have to look at design, which isn't any different from when we're doing a top-down architecture. Design matters, the appearance of the output matters, whether it's bottom-up or top-down. But bottom-up does have some different design features that we care about. We care about context setting. Context setting is very important for an every page is page one topic because people could drop in it from anywhere. So you don't know where they're coming from. You need to make sure that you tell them where they've arrived. So what design features are there that support context setting? And some tools have very specific support for that. What support is there for context navigation? Because if I arrive somewhere and I realize, oh, I'm in slightly the wrong place, I've arrived in the topic for version 6 and I'm using version 5. How do I get to version 5? That's context navigation. What kind of support do you have for that? You may have a reduced or an absent TOC. I think one of the things I've stressed over and over again is that a bottom-up information architecture does not necessarily involve throwing out all your top-down. In some cases, the combination of top-down and bottom-up is what you want, and the bottom-up actually lets you simplify the top-down because the top-down isn't having to carry all of the weight, and it can then perform a very useful role. So you may be reducing your TOC, you may be hiding the TOC, you may be giving it a more subordinate role. What facilities exist to help you do that? And then, of course, links, how do they appear, become an important part of it as well. And then output. Output obviously is important for bottom-up and top-down. And you need to look at two forms of output. Hypertext output, which typically is HTML or its help formats. Increasingly, of course, help formats are themselves HTML, but they're HTML in a sort of captive environment, so it's still a slightly different format. And then you need to look at what is also the support for linear formats, for paper, for PDF. Again, we are talking here about an inversion of priorities. So a top-down information architecture generally still has some linking. It generally does have ways for people to get from the interior to some other part of the interior, but it's not optimized for that. That's not the primary design consideration. With a bottom-up information architecture, we are primarily designing for the person who arrives in the middle and wants to go to somewhere else in the middle. But that doesn't exclude creating content that is designed to be read linearly, or giving them an output that is designed to be read linearly. And in many cases, that remains important for some organizations. Either important because it's a genuine information need, or important because the politics of getting rid of it are more trouble than they're worth, which can certainly happen in some cases. Sometimes you'll need to have several releases where you prove, no, we've got a better architecture here, and look, everybody is using it, now we can start to drop that stuff. So usually you need to be able to produce those things as well. One of the big questions that you're going to need to deal with in this is structured versus unstructured. Structured approaches give you two really big important features. One is support for greater consistency. So every page is page one topics conform to a type, as we mentioned at the beginning, and getting that consistency of type, but also the consistency of linking. The structure can do an awful lot for you there. And structure equals automation. So the structure can allow you to automate all kinds of complex linking and organizational tasks, particularly because those can be hard to envision. Oh, I see a mistake in my slide. That should be hard to envision bottom up. They're easy to envision top down, That's what we've always done. It's very easy to visualize because it was designed for visualization. And we can visualize the organization of our content just as much as the reader can visualize it. In fact, in many cases, the TOC is more important to the writer to give them a sense that they've done everything than it is to the reader, who's probably skipping through it, scanning for a phrase or something like this, rather than really appreciating the overall structure that the TOC implies. So the ability to visualize is a big part of the top-down architecture. What we've seen in bottom-up content is that the relationships between pieces of content are expressed through hypertext in the content itself. So there is no, the view that makes sense, the view that works for the reader here is the bottom-up view. I'm in the middle of this article on the Manitowoc Crater, and it mentions Quebec, and I don't know where Quebec is, so I click on Quebec, and I broaden my context and find out where Quebec is, and then I come back here. So I've navigated from within the content rather than by trying to go back up to a table of contents and try to find where the subject of Quebec may be treated. This is very, very clear. The relationship is very, very clear here in the individual page. The problem is that hypertext is very hard to visualize. If you want to try and step back and say, is my content all organized? That can be very hard to visualize in a bottom-up architecture. So because of that, there's a really strong reasons to look at structured approaches to creating bottom-up architectures, because it allows you to automate this, and so you can then, your organization becomes the structure you put on the content, and then that structure is then used to generate all of the linking and the navigational elements that work really well from the bottom up, but are hard to visualize from the top down. And therefore, you get your sense of organization through the structure rather than through the TOC. So this gives you a really, structured authoring techniques really give you, I think, more of a bonus when you're doing a bottom-up information architecture. They give you a bonus in both forms, clearly, but an even bigger bonus in bottom-up. So let's talk a little bit about where the various tools sit. This is a very simple matrix trying to map where the common tools that we use fit. And the categories that we've been talking about, structured versus unstructured, bottom-up versus top-down. So the top-down unstructured are the traditional stuff that we've worked with for the last 25 years and more. Would be represented by desktop publishing programs like FrameMaker, PageMaker, InDesign. Would be represented by word processors like Word and OpenOffice and WordPerfect. Would be represented by help authoring tools, RoboHelp, Flair. Now, as I stated at the beginning, this doesn't mean that you can't do bottom-up or even structured writing with these tools. It's about identifying where their sweet spots are, where the principal primary design consideration, the architecture of the content that people had in mind when they designed these tools, was in the unstructured top-down space for these. In the structured top-down space, we have DocBook and Ditta, and there's a number of others, but DocBook and Ditta really represent most of what people are talking about at the moment. DocBook in particular, because it is very much a book-oriented, really fits the top-down structured approach. Ditta is, because it is more topic-based, is not quite as top-down as DocBook is, but still fundamentally it's defaults. In other words, you create a map, which is a hierarchy which gets transformed into a table of contents. The default way you use DITA is very top-down. You can absolutely use DITA to do a bottom-up structured approach. It wasn't designed fundamentally with that in mind, but it has a lot of features that work, and I've helped some people do this. So it's definitely an option, but its default, if you like, is in the top-down structured space. Now, in the bottom-up unstructured space, we have wikis, and I find that a lot of the people that I'm working with at the moment, helping people to implement Every Page is Page One, are working on wikis. It's probably the largest single set of platforms that I'm dealing with. And also blogging platforms, and we might add a lot of other web-oriented technologies. I don't know if any of you follow Tom Johnson's blog, but he's been talking about using a combination of Markdown and Jekyll to do what I would say most. He's doing a kind of hybrid top-down, bottom-up, and using these web-oriented tools. It's really noticeable, of course, that the bottom-up tools are ones that originated on the web. The web is a bottom-up media, and it kind of figures that when a tool or a platform comes out of the web space, it's much more likely to be a bottom-up than a top-down tool. And again, because you can do any information architecture in any tool, you can use wikis and blogging platforms and web tools and static site generators to do top-down information architectures as well. In fact, I know a lot of people who have been required to work in wikis because the higher-ups in their company wanted the collaborative features of wikis, and then have had to do quite a struggle to get PDFs out of them. So we often end up having to sort of deal with these kind of hybrid things. So it can be done, but these tools were designed for that space. Then in the structured bottom-up, there's actually quite a few tools here, and they mostly come from the programming documentation space, at least the ones I'm familiar with. There are probably some others out there that people could name from other spaces. But they're designed, they're special purpose. Javadoc and Sphinx are both designed for doing programming language documentation, particularly API documentation. They are structured. Neither of them uses XML, but XML is not the whole world of structure. So they do a structured bottom-up approach, but special purpose. So one of the projects I've been working on for quite some time now is the SPIFFE architecture. SPIFFE architecture is designed to be a more general purpose, bottom-up structured approach. And I'm going to spend the next part of the presentation doing a very, very brief demonstration of what SPIFFE is designed to do. So if you bear with me while I get to the right screen. All right. So this is a page from the SPIFFE documentation, which is, of course, created using SPIFFE. One of the things you'll see is that there is no table of contents on the left-hand side. There is a home, and there's a list of collections, which is, well, it's a list. And if you go into these, you will get what looks much more like a traditional table of contents. So there's a kind of mix. We're using some bottom-up and some top-down concepts here. The example I want to show you is from the section on the topic on reuse in SPIFFE and EpoSimple. And specifically, this paragraph, which talks about reuse by inclusion. And at the end, the final sentence says, EpoSimple includes support for 3 such units, 3 units for doing reuse by inclusion: text objects, fragments, and strings. And you can see that there are no links on these. Now, I said at the beginning that one of the key metrics was how quickly can you add new content. And when you add new content, what that really should mean is you add the new content and you get complete integration of that content very, very quickly and easily. So I'm going to grab some topics here, and I'm going to drop these into the development folder, and I'm going to drop these into the demo folder. So all I have done is move some topics out of quarantine to where the system can see them. And now I'm going to start a build, which is not going to crash just because it's now a live demo. And that's going to take a minute or two. So I'm going to let it run and come back over and talk about Spiffy for a second. So Spiffy is an open source framework for creating structured writing systems. So it isn't something you pull out of the box like you would FrameMaker and start writing. Actually, FrameMaker, strictly speaking, isn't that way either. You kind of need to set up templates and stuff. But it's, especially in its present form, it's not something you're just going to download and start typing. It is much more a tool for information architects to create systems. It will get much closer to the pull it out and start typing stage with a few updates that are coming later in this year. It's definitely usable now, but it is still very much a framework. And the key thing is it's optimized for bottom-up architectures. That's what it was designed to do. One of its key principles is ease of authoring. If you have used any of the existing structured writing systems, particularly things like Ditter, DocBook, S1000D, you know that they are quite complex. You have to know a lot about how the process works. It takes a lot of training to get someone to be effective in those systems. They're very powerful systems, and they can do a lot of very useful things, but it definitely takes a while to learn this. Spiffy is designed to reduce that as much as possible, because in a bottom-up information architecture you want to have lots of authors and you want to have occasional authors contributing stuff and have it just sucked in and integrated. And so it becomes very important to have ease of authoring. And to do that, it uses declarative markup, which I will show you. It uses simple subject-specific markup, and it minimizes the requirement to understand the system. It automates the organization. It automates link generation, which is, if the demo hasn't crashed while we're talking about it, we're going to see in a second. And it automates list generation, which is, these are the really key navigational features. So let's see if it hasn't crashed. Okay, that build completed. So I'm going to come up over here. Everybody cross their fingers. There we go. So suddenly those 3 things are links. Now notice the only difference I made was I added some topics. It wasn't this topic. This topic never got touched. But now that I added those 5 new topics, these had something to link to. And if I click on strings now, what I get is a list of topics related to the feature strings. So there is a concept called the fragments demo that talks about strings. There is a feature topic on strings. There is a concept reuse in Spiffy and EpoSimple, which is the one we were looking at. And there is a task topic about how to process strings. This list was generated automatically by Spiffy because previous time it found no topics on strings. This time it found 4. because all those ones we've added. And so it automatically generated a list of them. And now I can go through this list and say, I would like to see the fragments demo. And I click on that, and that's where I go. So there we've seen automatic link generation, automatic list generation, two of the key features. Oops. I may come back to this, but I think what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to show you, because I think time is running away again. So we will come over here and look at what the markup looked like, because I want to get back to that idea of a very simple approach to doing the authoring. So this is in a spiffy topic in Oxygen XML editor, which is my favorite editor. And full disclosure, I'm both they're a client of mine and a partner of mine. So that recommendation must come with that caveat, but there's a reason that I'm a partner of theirs and a user. So here we have that sentence. And you can see it looks pretty much like an ordinary sentence, and you might be able to see if the resolution is good, that there's a slight orange box around these things. And that indicates simply that this is what I call an annotation. And all that's being annotated here is the fact that text objects are a feature of the system. You saw that little pop-up box, which doesn't stay very long, unfortunately. But these are features of the system. And the only markup here was telling it that these are the names of features. So to show you how easy it is to create that markup, I can come down here and say an object is a piece of text that is smaller than a topic. Topics are a feature of the system. I'll hit enter. It asks me which annotation I want. Tap F to bring up feature. That's it. Now the next time this is processed, that word will become a link either to a topic on topics or to a list of topics on topics. That's it. That's how simple it is for the author to mark things up like this. And of course there's a mechanism in the background that's figuring all this stuff out, and the way it figures out which topics are on which subjects is here at the top. So we know that this is a feature. This topic talks about the feature strings because it's been indexed as such. So authors are responsible for indexing their topics to say what kind of thing they talk about. So this one talks about the feature strings, fragments, text objects, and it talks about the task of content reuse. And anything that refers to one of those tasks or features will then link to this topic. So there we have automatic link generation, automatic list generation, and a very, very simple approach to how this stuff gets authored. Now I can go on and talk about some other features of Spiffy, but if people have questions, this would probably be a good time to pause and address any issues people want to talk about, and then we can go on into some of the other features if people are interested.
All right. We don't have any questions so far. Let me give you a chance to do that, or type in your questions, and I'll show you what's coming up. Next month, we have part 2 from Joe Devney. Unhappy customers are just the beginning. He talks about what can happen if you don't have docs or it's poorly written. Things can happen, lawsuits, and your companies can go away. We actually have some examples of that. Some of the biggest airline crashes, I learned this at SDC Interchange just 2 weeks ago. Some of the biggest airline crashes that are known were due to technical documentation errors. And some of those companies aren't around anymore. So Joe's going to give real-life examples this time. Part 1 for him is also on the YouTube channel. He talked about, kinds of things you need to have in mind, but he's going to give real-life examples next month, including possibly some insider information about what happened in San Francisco about a year and a half ago. It's sure to be exciting. That's the wrong way. Our mastermind session, the next one is April 27th. This is a group about, joining your networks with other people and really learning from each other. It's been a really fascinating place to be a part of it. All right, so Mark, let's see if we have some questions.
Okay.
So far, it looks like they're still typing. I had a couple.
Okay.
So visualization, totally understand the point you're making with that. It's always been hard for me. As humans, we're really good at organizing, bucketing, right? Hierarchy, we really love that stuff. Do you have any strategies to practice to learn not to default to that?
Yeah, it's a really difficult problem because, this is how we organize things in the physical world. The physical world has these basic dimensional limitations that once you put something next to something else, that space is occupied. You can't put it next to a third thing and a fourth thing and a fifth thing. What is interesting, to notice is that if you're shopping on Amazon, the number of different facets it's using to assemble things on the fly, the list of other people who purchased these 3 books that you purchased, also purchased this 4th book, and a number of different factors are being used to generate that juxtaposition, and it really is all about juxtaposition. And in the physical world, juxtaposition you can only do one, right? And it's organized by how it's juxtaposed. Whereas in the digital world, the juxtaposition still has to happen on the screen. The screen still only has so many dimensions. One thing can only be next to each other on the screen. But it happens dynamically. So I can query in so many different ways, and every time I change a factor, I get a new representation. And I think it's good to go through, particularly e-commerce sites are great for this because they're doing this kind of thing all the time. I love the way used car sites work, Auto Trade or Auto Catch, because they have these faceted navigation schemes where you can decide, well, the most important thing to me is the car I want has to be blue. Or somebody else, it might be that it has to have a manual transmission. And so you can group these things dynamically in these different ways. And so we have to learn to think in terms of what is the data that allows us to juxtapose things in a particular way. And how do I capture that data as opposed to thinking, how do I juxtapose stuff? How do I pick how stuff gets juxtaposed once for everybody? You've got to start thinking in terms of how do I capture the data that would allow content to be juxtaposed dynamically based on different users' needs and different users' interests. And studying the sites that do it with that idea in mind really can help reset that mindset and think about what's the data that's driving this. Because all of this stuff essentially is data-driven. Everything I just showed in that demo is data-driven. And what the author is doing then is not doing the juxtaposition, but they're recording the data that's used to do it. And that's the change of habit of mind that we have to get into to do this.
Fascinating. I never, car sites. I'm going to go look at a couple now. I'm too used to going in and doing what you need to do and not really looking at the structure. And I'm going to have to go look at that now, just from an outside perspective. Interesting. All right. So, and I had one other question too. You mentioned Markdown a little bit, and you've played with that some?
Yeah.
Any insight?
Well,
you want to tell us a little bit more about, I know Tom Johnston, I've seen him talk about it a little bit, but I haven't actually gotten my hands on it.
Sure. Markdown is a very, very simple format that is designed to make it much easier to author HTML. HTML, is, you get into the coding and it gets pretty complex pretty quickly. So it's all full of ugly angle brackets. It's the same thing as trying to type XML directly. And so Markdown is an approach to essentially creating HTML pages with a much, much simpler markup. Perhaps if you could make me the presenter again. I've been playing with the idea behind markup and Markdown and saying, is there a way that we could use this same approach to do make authoring much easier, but still get the kinds of annotations that we want in structured content. So I can show you something. This is going to be part of the Spiffy project at some point, hopefully sometime this year. Let's see where I want to be. Okay. If people see this, I'm going to blow it up a little bit.
Looks good.
So if anybody's familiar with a data format called YAML, which stands for Yet Another Markup Language, and it basically consists of words followed by colons, a very, very familiar format that we write in all the time, and a combination of that with indentation to show subordination. So this is a combination of the ideas behind YAML and the ideas behind Markdown. In Markdown, a paragraph, for instance, is just represented by a blank line. Again, the idea behind Markdown was to have a markup format that was as much as possible like a text email. So it uses things like, if you want to have something be bold in Markdown, you would do and now that will be represented in bold. So two very, very basic formats. This format, which I call SAM, which stands for Semantic Authoring Markdown, it combines the two to essentially do what we've typically done with XML. So we have a block, and the block has a title. The block is, first of all, it's a geographic feature. This is a topic type. This topic is describing a geographic feature, the Manukau walking crater, the one that we just saw, that we used in the example earlier. And it has certain context setting attributes, like its coordinates, its diameter, its age. And then it has the body of the article. And we say the Manukau walking crater is one of the oldest known impact craters. So here, simply by using square brackets around the word that we want to annotate, and then we say the impact crater, this is a feature. Feature here is within the context of geographic features. So we're in the geography domain. This is a geographic feature. It is the largest known visible impact crater on Earth. So we're annotating Earth. That's why it's in square brackets. And we're saying this is a planet. This is pretty elementary kind of stuff. It's located in a particular place, in a particular province, in a particular country. And it created a particular time, and so on and so forth. So essentially, what Sam is doing is taking these ideas and creating that kind of markup that I just showed you using XML in the previous example in something very, very simple that can be easily typed in just a text editor. And this can have the potential to greatly reduce the authoring overhead, make it, first of all, simpler to author, let you use simpler tools, make it accessible to people who may be very resistant to learning XML or learning a complex editor, can give you simple content in a format that's suitable to them using a very, very simple bit of a markup that anybody can learn. And we have seen that Markdown in particular has getting wider and wider adoption all the time. It's being used in more and more web-based systems. So this is a small extension of Markdown to give us the kind of annotations that you need to do a bottom-up architecture. It's not a full replacement for XML. It won't do everything XML will do. But it lets us do the kinds of topic typing and annotation that we need to do a bottom-up information architecture.
Awesome. All right. Well, we don't have any more questions, and we're kind of out of time. So I'm going to remind everybody to, let me change this one back and make sure everybody remembers to vote for new sessions. You choose the topics. We find the experts to teach them, so be sure and vote for new sessions there at the SurveyMonkey link. And you can add your topics to the list, and we'll just keep voting and seeing what happens. This is how we figure out to get Mark, because everybody's interested in all of this stuff. And if you want to see the old sessions, or if you want to rewatch this one, be sure to go to the TC Dojo channel on YouTube. All right. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Mark. That's awesome as always. And we'll see you all again next month.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.